over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Good afternoon and welcome back. You know, when President Trump ran for office in 2024, he promised to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine within 100 days of taking office. The unofficial centerpiece of his plan was the proposals raised publicly by U.S. General Kellogg earlier in 2024. At April's EU-UK meeting in London, however, the Kellogg Plus plan died and was buried. Now, President Trump says that he was considering joining talks between Russia and Ukraine that are expected to be held in Istanbul this coming Thursday. While Denmark sends $100 billion to build up Ukraine's arms industry using seized Russian funds. How can the U.S. extricate itself from this mess? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am, by the way, Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historic context in which most events take place. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. So on today's episode, the issue before us is Russia and Ukraine are poised to sit down this week in Istanbul for their first high-level face-to-face talks since 2022. They might change the name of the plan, but will some semblance of the Kellogg Plan carry the day? Well, let's talk to my guest. He is the author of the recently published book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump, and he's a retired professor of politics and economics at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California, Dr. Jack Rasmus. Jack, it's been too long. Welcome back.
Glad to join you.
Let's start with the Kellogg Plan. As you wrote, quote, as others have reported, the Europeans and Ukraine have developed their own set of proposals over the past few weeks in the flurry of their meetings in Europe, the most recent occurring in Paris. The U.S. reportedly caught the Europeans by surprise, presented their plan for discussion in lieu of the Europeans. The latter then refused to discuss the Kellogg Plan, and in return, the U.S. delegation left the meeting. Talk a little bit about the incongruence between the U.S. plan, the Kellogg Plan, and the European plan, and why the U.S. plan at that time was such a non-starter.
Yeah, well, you know, the Kellogg Plan, which has always been Trump's Plan A, you might say, during the election, and he appointed Kellogg immediately after he was elected. And the Kellogg Plan is what the U.S. has been going with. The Kellogg Plan called for recognition of Russia's control of the eastern provinces. There are those four oblasts, as they call provinces in the east, and Crimea, which Russia has pretty much occupied now militarily, except a smaller part of a couple of the provinces. The Kellogg Plan called for Ukraine to recognize that and to sit down and negotiate that and other issues, and to freeze the negotiations, freeze the military action in place where it existed, and recognize Russia's demand for no NATO membership. All of that for Ukraine and Zelensky has been a non-starter. Zelensky's position has been for years now that the Ukraine will begin negotiations when Russia leaves. In other words, capitulate, and we'll talk about tribunals and reparations. So that's obviously a non-starter for Russia. And the problem lurking behind here is that the Europeans are backing Ukraine 100%. So Ukraine's position, Zelensky's position, is Europe's position. Which means it's almost a non-starter for negotiations. And the U.S. had proposed that. And as you indicated, Rubio and others went to London for that conference, which was a European Ukraine conference here to present and develop their plan. And the U.S. kind of surprised the Europeans saying, here's our plan, Kellogg, right? And they were a little bit shocked, and they refused to discuss the Kellogg plan. So Rubio and the others left, and they went forward with their plan. Now, what is Ukraine's position? Although Zelensky's jumping all over the place, but the position is the same one they fall back on, and that position is no negotiations unless ceasefire first. In other words, stop fighting, freeze in place. For 30 days. This is Ukraine, Zelensky's position, and we'll come to the bargaining negotiation table and negotiate with you only under that condition. That was the position until last week. And of course, what that really means is, okay, Russia stops fighting, stop gaining, because Russia's gaining all across the front. And, we'll talk with you, but you got to stop your gains. And in the meantime, the 30 days, we, Ukraine, will replenish our weapons from Europe and the West, and we will mobilize more troops, and we will occupy more positions on the front while you're not doing anything, which is kind of dumb. There's no way that Russia is going to agree to that, because Russia's position is we'll meet with you anytime, any place, but no ceasefire first. Let's negotiate the ceasefire. So you see the fundamental differences. Ukraine, Europe saying ceasefire first, then we'll negotiate. And the Russia saying, no, we'll negotiate the ceasefire. So that's the big stickler. Now, what's happened recently is you've got Zelensky saying, okay, we'll go to Istanbul because Putin had said last week, immediately that we'll meet you in Istanbul. Of course, Russia's not going to cease fire while meeting in Istanbul, but Zelensky says, "Well, I'm going to Istanbul anyway, and I'll talk with you," knowing that Russia is not going to cease fire, which Zelensky will then say, I'm not going if Putin's not going and they're not ceasefire. And so this is a maneuver by Zelensky in Ukraine here, agreeing to go to Istanbul because he knows Putin's not going to go to Istanbul. He knows that. Zelensky knows that. And he knows that Russia's not going to cease fire while negotiations are going on. So while he says he's going to Istanbul, he's not going to go to Istanbul. Now, you got this new twist that Trump says, okay, I'll go to Istanbul while you guys are there. He's putting pressure on Zelensky to go, so we will see what happens. Will Zelensky go? Will he send a delegation? Because Russia will send a delegation. Delegation, excuse me. Russia will send a delegation to Istanbul. And the question is, will Zelensky, Ukraine send one? Will Zelensky go? Trump is putting pressure on Zelensky to sit down with the Russians. That's what he's trying to do. Whether he does that or not is up for debate because Zelensky knows the Europeans are behind him 100%. The European position is Russia's got a ceasefire, then we'll sit down. In other words, capitulate here tactically for 30 days. So that's what's keeping Zelensky going. It's Europe that's keeping him going. It's Starmer, it's Merz, it's Macron. They're 100% behind Ukraine and Zelensky's position. And that raises another question we can talk about if you want. Why is Europe so obsessed about keeping the war going? Because that's what's happening right now.
Before we get to that, a couple things. One, the Ukraine seems to be, Robert Brown, thank you so much for that $10 super sticker. Greatly appreciate that contribution. It seems as though Ukraine is trying to posture from a position of power when, in fact, all it really has is a position of weakness. And there really seems to be a considerable change in plan from the Biden administration to the Trump administration. I remember very clearly, in fact, he was on the show yesterday, and Scott Ritter reiterated the point, if Kamala Harris had won the election, we would be in, or we would be very close to World War III by now, because she would have escalated, she would have followed the Biden logic and escalated this war, drawing us closer to a nuclear confrontation, where Trump seems to be trying to find a way out of this. Your thoughts?
Yeah, very clearly, Biden and Harris, that was just a march towards escalation, and the next level of escalation was going to be some kind of direct U.S. On the ground involvement there. I mean, already you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of U.S. and NATO advisors who are operating the advanced equipment, the radars and the missiles and the HIMARS and all that, ATACMS. The Ukrainians, it's too technical, and the U.S. isn't going to allow them to do that. So the U.S. is there, the French are there, the Poles are there, the NATO is there. This is a NATO-Russian war with Ukraine as a proxy. Then the big question is why. But apart from that, yes, we would be very close to a direct conflict with Russia. Russia sees this whole thing as existential, and it could soon very easily slip into a tactical nuclear exchange. In fact, there's a whole group of U.S. neocons who say that that's okay. We can fight a tactical nuke war as long as it's on Ukraine ground, you see.
Correct.
We got some real crazies here in Washington. And you got to understand that the Trump position is vacillating, depending upon whether the neocons are influencing him last or whether smarter voices in the administration are getting his ear. Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, and J.D. Vance and some others versus the neocons, which were this guy Waltz, who got kicked upstairs because of another issue to the UN, or Rubio and some others. You got to understand the Trump position goes back and forth here because it's influenced. Trump, notoriously, whoever gets his ear last has a big influence on him. And this sort of turn after the Kellogg collapsed by the Trump administration occurred when Trump went to the funeral of the Pope there in Rome recently, and they maneuvered him into a sit down with Zelensky. They, meaning Macron and Starmer and others, the Europeans maneuvered him. He comes back and then he starts talking tough about sanctions and so forth, which are still in the wing here. He's flip-flopping one day. One day he says, Ukraine and Zelensky, really don't want a solution, an end to the war, which is true. And the next day he's talking sanctions against Russia, and, he's talking down Russia. So he's flip-flopping, which is typical Trump, very, very volatile, very, very much vacillating on these positions because he's being pushed hard by the neocons and the imperialists in the U.S. who want to continue this war. And of course, the neocons in Europe very much want to continue this war because without this war, they don't have the excuse to militarize their economy, which is what these European leaders and these umbrella institutions in Europe, the European Commission, European Council, Parliament, and all that. These are umbrella institutions that were imposed upon the countries in Europe for the last 25 years. And that's what's ruling Europe, you see, especially the foreign policy. It's NATO and the European Commission and Council. And of course, with the acquiescence of guys like Macron and Starmer, but it gives them a sort of an isolation away from popular discontent. So the neocons in Europe want to continue this because I believe, for a number of reasons, but I believe they need the war to continue. If two things are going to happen. One, if they are going to justify spending $1 trillion on defense now, which is what they're talking about, $1 trillion or more to militarize their economy, because their economies haven't been militarized. The U.S. has provided them the military umbrella. The U.S. has thrown a lot of money into Europe every year, supporting NATO and all the rest, and it's kept European economies afloat. And it looks like Trump may pull out of that financial support of NATO and Europe. And they know this. European neocons know this. And they're looking for and planning an alternative, and that's to, remilitarize their economies. It's going to take 4 or 5 years to do that at a minimum. And they're going to spend $1 trillion or more. And that means the nice social benefits in Europe are going to go away. It's going to look more like America in terms of the lopsided spending on military versus social programs. Europe has benefited from the American military umbrella and cost, so that they can throw some freebies around to their populace in terms of benefits. That's going to come to an end. But I think they really want to continue this war for that reason. There's other reasons too, because these leaders in Europe are politically shaky now. And it wouldn't be the first time that politicians stirred up some conflict, a foreign policy crisis, in order to continue to stay in office. I think there's some of that going on. And I think there's also some of these leaders are really deluded. They think that, the Russians are coming again. At least that's what their propaganda now is in Europe, and it's really quite heavy, very heavy propagandizing the population that the Russians, if they win in Ukraine, they're going to be in Berlin and in Paris very soon. So we got to stop them in Ukraine, which is nonsense, because the Russian army is 1.3 million people, 700,000 just in Ukraine. There's no way they could invade the West, and I don't think Putin really wants all that trouble. They're struggling to really defeat NATO in Ukraine. How are they going to take on NATO everywhere in Europe? Also, historically, you got to realize when the Soviets reconquered Ukraine during World War II, it took almost 3 million men to do that. The force was 3 million. So they got barely 700,000. They're going to struggle to try to end this war and a compromise in Ukraine, I believe. So there's no Russian attack on Europe, but that's what they're throwing at the people of Europe to justify the war and military buildup in Europe. That's the key to understand. So that's how you understand the European leaders, Macron, Starmer, want to continue this war in Ukraine. And of course, that's what Zelensky is backed by. And that's why he's so obstinate about negotiations and doesn't want, because he knows the Europeans have his back. And here comes Trump in the U.S. saying, hey, Biden threw away $300 billion in this black hole, and we got nothing to show for it. And you got to understand, this will be my last comment for context. So you got to understand that what Trump represents his policies, his foreign policies, cutting U.S. aid, cutting endowment for democracy, cutting back spending in Europe and so forth. Mm-hmm. What this represents is that the U.S. empire realizes that it's too costly to run the empire as structured now, that we're throwing too much money into Europe and Ukraine, which is not strategic anymore to the empire. What's strategic is the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to reorient the spending. They're cutting the foreign policy excesses, including excessive generals in the Pentagon here. And they're going to try to move that savings into spending on weapon systems, in which they're behind. The U.S. is behind in drones. It's behind in hypersonic missiles and so forth. So the U.S. is on a crash course to try to move the money around, restructure the cost of the empire, you see? And that means getting the hell out of supporting Europe and getting the hell out of Ukraine, trying to keep the Middle East from blowing up with Iran, right? And moving all the investment and the focus to China and Taiwan and the China seas. That's what the U.S. and Trump is trying to do. When you understand that, you understand what's going on with the U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Trump wants to get the hell out, but the neocons won't let him so far.
A couple of things. One, some business we have to take care of. We've got some new members, new subscribers on YouTube. We've got Peggy Parks Miller. Thank you very much. AM, thank you very much. Carol Asbaram, thank you very much. And Carol, thank you to my brilliant producer. I finally got your name pronounced properly. Asbaram. AZ, oh my goodness. Madhu Jabaya, thank you as well. And Hakeem Muhammad, thank you all so much for your subscribing on the YouTube channel. Greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate that. Jack, there are a couple of things I want to unpack from what you've just laid out. One is you talked about whoever gets in Trump's ear last, and that's been a consistent theme about why he vacillates so much. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he has no worldview. He does not have a guiding ideology. He doesn't have a guiding perspective on the world that he, as president, is trying to maintain or trying to accomplish. All he wants to do is capture real estate and build resorts and build buildings. So I think that's one of the reasons why the last person in his ear tends to hold sway. I really appreciate your explanation about the shift away from the U.S. support of Europe to the Pacific as the rationale for what's going on with this war. And just if you could elaborate a little bit on, so the Europeans are pushing the war. And I've been asking this question of a lot of people, and you're the first one to really provide a clear, concise answer. But why the shift in Europe and why the shift now? Is it that the European neocons are holding sway over European policy, and they're the ones that are managing this cut in social programs and quality of life for retirees and working class people in Europe, and they're now shifting their sight to an American model? Is that what's driving this?
Well, what's driving it is they realize that
they who?
The European leadership, the neocons, in the European Commission and Council, that's where the neocons are. That's the decision-making bodies of the EU. They realize that Trump, in particular, in the U.S. in general, is making a shift in the empire, and it will be withdrawing first its financial support from NATO. There's no doubt about it. And I think Trump, before his term is up, will make a significant move to withdraw from NATO because it costs too much. And the returns are not there for the empire, right? They don't need that. It's yesterday's empire. This is the new empire with the BRICS and the global South and China and Russia and all the rest challenging it. They've got to, make a shift here. And the Europeans know that, the writing's on the wall that the U.S. is going to eventually withdraw from NATO. And keeping the war going keeps the U.S. in NATO, you see. It's kind of hard for the U.S. To totally withdraw because neocons in the U.S. will go all after Trump if he does. If he does this thing, cuts it loose immediately, they're going to be all over him, right? So they know, the European neocons, the Starmers and the Macrons, they know that the writing's on the wall. The U.S. is restructuring, shifting its empire focus. And that's why they know they've got to develop their own military now. But as I said, that takes 4 or 5 years because Europe's military is a joke, right? Russia is recruiting in 90 days volunteers to join its army, more 90,000, 30,000 a month, 90,000 every 3 months than the total European NATO force that exists today. I mean, Europe is a joke militarily. It's totally the U.S. backing them up. They don't even have the weapons production. They can't produce military artillery shells and so forth. They know they need 4 or 5 years. So they're going to helter-skelter move as fast as they can to raise money, to militarize, but they want to keep the U.S. in NATO in the meantime, you see? And I think their thought is, with the help of neocons in the U.S., they can maneuver Trump to keep him engaged in Ukraine and in NATO. And they might even change his mind because they know he's volatile. But at worst, they'll wait him out. They think they can wait him out for 4 years. You see, that's how the thinking they got going, I believe, here. So that kind of explains where Europe is in all this. But that's the big issue. If you look at parallels historically, let's take the Vietnam War, okay? Did the U.S. and Nixon agree with the North Vietnamese to cease fire? Or did the North Vietnamese agree to cease fire first before negotiations in Paris?
No.
No, they didn't.
No.
They fought, the fighting was continued. And in January of 1973, the accords were agreed with between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. South Vietnamese never participated. South Vietnamese would not negotiate and participate for political reasons, just like Ukraine won't. Ukraine will never negotiate, okay? This has to be a U.S.-Russia deal, not Ukraine. So, if you look at the Vietnam War parallel, the South Vietnamese weren't involved in negotiations. The U.S. negotiated North Vietnam and imposed the settlement on the South Vietnamese. That's what's going to have to happen again. And by the way, that settlement in Vietnam did not occur until December of 1973. The accords and the negotiations were January, but the war continued and the fighting continued, and the U.S. drew down step by step its forces. But it really wasn't over until December 1973.
Well, another reason why Putin is, I think, so hell-bent on, no, we're not ceasefiring and then negotiating, is because he fell for that trick twice. He fell for that trick with the Minsk Accords, and he fell for that trick with the Istanbul Accords. And he's saying, we're not doing this again. Been there, done that, lost both times.
Yeah, I mean, that's the history.
Right.
Very clear. In Minsk in 2015, he agreed after taking Crimea to the Minsk Agreement, which was supposed to allow autonomy for the eastern provinces, which are heavily Russian. The problem is when the coup occurred in 2014, engineered by the U.S., Victoria Nuland, it's a fact. There's all kind of documentation now and phone call evidence and so forth. That, when that occurred, the U.S. got Russia to agree to a kind of a truce, a Minsk agreement, and the heads of Germany and France, Merkel and Holland there, signed on to that whole thing. And they used that period with the Minsk truce, the military truce, to expand and prepare for this attack in the east, in the Donbass, right? And they built up tremendous defense positions and everything. And then in January of 2022, they started attacking. Ukraine, started shelling and attacking the provinces in the east. So they started the war. And, Trump in February 24th finally, Putin in February 2024 finally joined in and stopped them. And then, of course, as soon as the Russians invaded, with a force of only 90,000, by the way, I mean, you couldn't conquer 90,000, couldn't conquer Ukraine, right? It was all about an intimidation by the Russians, show of force, to get Ukraine and Zelensky to the bargaining table, which they did immediately in Istanbul. And they agreed with Zelensky in Istanbul to allow autonomy for those provinces in the east. Let them have their language, let them have their religion, because the nationalists, the proto-fascists, neo-Nazis, whatever, that were deep in the government of Ukraine, their whole thing was, we're going to really punish the Russian-speaking populace here. No, can't use your language, can't use your religion, your kids can't go to school, etc. As part of crushing the opposition. So there was an agreement in Istanbul that Zelensky signed on to. He agreed to it. But then at the last minute, before he actually signed the document, this occurred in March, April. Right?
In April,
Before he signed the document, in comes Boris Johnson from NATO, from the UK, who was the prime minister then. And he convinces Zelensky, no, don't sign anything off. We're going to give you all the weapons you want. We can defeat Russia militarily with just some military pressure. Putin's going to
So wait a minute. So wait a minute. So based upon the previous analysis and outstanding analysis that you've been providing, Boris Johnson going in to scuttle the deal, was he going in as the operative of NATO? Or was he going in at the direction of Victoria Nuland and the West and the U.S.? Who was?
No, he was NATO's voice, right? And of course, NATO is really run by the U.S.
at the time.
So he would not do that without the U.S. knowledge and approval. He would not do that.
So at that time, NATO was still the lapdog of the United States under the Biden administration.
Yes.
And now that Trump has come in, we're starting to see the division between the United States and NATO. I wanted folks listening to this to be very clear about that point.
Yes, that's an excellent point, and that's the fact.
And final point on that. So now that you have a increase in the militarization of Europe, are they also still operating at the behest of the U.S. military industrial complex? They're going to get their weapons from Lockheed Martin. They're going to get their weapons from Raytheon. They're going to get their weapons from Northrop Grumman. Or are they going to build up their own domestic military manufacturing capacity?
Both.
Okay.
In the meantime, they don't have the military production capability, right? In the meantime, Europe is going to float a $50 billion bond that they're talking about, and they're going to buy U.S. weapons. I think that's the only source that they have, right?
So wait a minute. So does that then answer the question of the next piece we were going to get to from the Libertarian Institute? Denmark sends $1 billion to build up Ukrainian arms industry using seized Russian funds because they want to start building a European military industrial capacity.
You got to understand, in the previous 3 years of this war, Europe has given Ukraine weapons in kind, the old Russian Soviet weapons, and it's also given them funds.
Mhm.
But the funds that Europe gave Ukraine are loans.
Okay.
The U.S. and Biden did not give Ukraine loans. It just gave them the money.
Mhm.
And that's what pissed Trump off. There's no way for the U.S. to get the money back. Europe, Ukraine owes Europe, and they will pay them back
Wait a minute.
eventually
Say that again.
if they win, right? But the
Ukraine-
U.S.,
you said-
that money is gone for the U.S.
You said Ukraine owes Europe.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you said Ukraine owns Europe.
No.
Got
The
it.
loans. The
Well,
loans. Yeah.
Right, but see, because the reason, if you had said Ukraine owns Europe, would have made sense if you follow the adage, if you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you, but if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. So anyway, I got you now. I got you. Ukraine owes Europe because all of that money was lent to Ukraine. I got you.
Right.
I got you.
Now you got to throw into the mix here the fact that Europe is sitting on $260 billion of frozen Russian assets.
Right.
And that's where Europe is going to get the short-term funds, I believe, to buy the weapons and keep Ukraine afloat. They are going, and they're already dipping into that.
Mhm.
All right. They've already stolen the interest for 3 years. And I believe they've dipped into the principal as well,
Mhm.
that 260 billion quietly, because if they did it too publicly, that would raise concerns in the global South, saying, well, gee, we don't want to keep our money in these Western European banks because you may freeze ours too if you don't like our politics, right?
Mhm.
That's a big risk for the euro and for Europe. So I think they're keeping it pretty quiet, but that's where they will go to get the money. Now they'll justify it by saying, oh, the money, these Russian assets that we're going to tap is to redevelop Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's not military, it's redevelopment, make it softer, right? And that's how they will finance the reconstruction of Ukraine, and through that cover, keep more money going into the military. Now, as I said, the U.S. does not have that pot of money. Biden just threw it away, with no strings attached.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Trump kept focusing on. And that's where the minerals deal comes in. You see, the minerals deal was always Trump's.
Wait a minute. Before you get to the minerals deal, on Biden giving the money to Ukraine, Biden was giving the money to Lockheed Martin. He was giving the money to Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman.
Part
through
of it.
Ukraine.
Part of it.
Okay.
Part of it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
The military assistance to Ukraine was partly U.S. military stocks. Were given so in kind, which they don't count,
Right.
or it was legislation passed under the Biden administration to pay the military industrial complex to produce and ship weapons to Ukraine. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And some money went to the CIA and some money went to defense and NSA and all that. Right. But in addition to that, you got to understand the U.S. has kept Ukraine's government afloat.
Oh, yeah.
All the salaries of the government.
Yes.
Everybody in government.
Pensions.
Which Zelensky has admitted is $8 billion a month.
We're paying
the U.S. has kept it afloat.
We're paying their pensions. We're paying their salaries.
Yeah, right.
We're paying their health care.
Yeah.
We're paying
and
if Americans understood that our tax dollars are paying to keep Ukraine afloat, while right now the neocons in the U.S. and the conservatives are trying to cut social programs here. Oh man, folks would be standing on their heads in the street.
Yeah, and you want to know something? Part of that funding for Ukraine's government includes paying the pensions of Ukrainian government workers. And You know, they can retire at age 60, full retirement at age
Yep.
60. So we're subsidizing age 60, and they're talking here about raising Social Security retirement to 69 and 70, right? Oh yeah, I mean it's just it's disgusting. It's absurd, you know. But the point here is that Biden just gave them the money. Period. No strings attached. And now the minerals deal, which is originally raised by Zelensky, by the way, in September, October of last year during the election, because in June, the U.S. passed the last legislative amount, 61 billion or something aid for Ukraine, said no more money legislatively. So Zelensky came up with this idea in September, October to get more money. And this is, originated with Biden. And he proposed that, look, you can share in our minerals extraction. But see, Zelensky has always tied the minerals deal to, we'll let you share in our minerals extraction and get some of your money back here that you can then give us in weapons, by the way, if you agree to U.S. security agreement with Ukraine. And those you protect Ukraine no matter what. He always tied the security agreement to the aid and the minerals deal. Well, then Trump picks it up, after he gets elected. Oh, that's maybe a way for us to get our money back, right? We'll agree to a minerals deal. And Trump's initial minerals deal in January and February, if you remember, was we'll have a minerals deal with Ukraine, and the profits from that, or a good part of it at least, will come to pay us back for the $300 billion Biden gave you for free, right? That was Trump's original minerals deal, okay? With no guarantee, no security guarantee. Just, okay, we'll develop it, and we'll use it to get paid back. Just like the Europeans are going to get paid back, we want to get paid back too, $300 billion, right? Okay, so, but no security. And that's what blew up. If you remember that meeting in the White House when Zelensky came, right? And J.D. Vance and Trump were all sitting around there. And they ended up in a kind of a diplomatic pissing match, right? And Zelensky went home. He didn't even go home. He went right to Starmer in London, and they had big hugs on TV, right? So why did Zelensky renege? Because Zelensky led Trump to believe that he's coming to Washington and he's going to agree to the deal, even though, there was no security agreement, which is always irks Zelensky. So he comes to Washington, and when he arrives, reportedly, in the U.S. press, he said, no, I'm not here to sign any deal because there's no security agreement. So, in other words, he sandbagged Trump, who had this big photo, video thing all set up, and he comes and he sits down. So, Trump and Vance were already ticked off at this guy. And then he sits down there and he argues with him. Right. And then, one passage there, he mumbles in Ukraine. He calls Vance a name in Ukraine, right? And that pisses everybody off. And then it went downhill from there, right? And we all saw that. And he scoots out. He doesn't even talk with anybody in Congress. He just scoots out and leaves. Well, they repackaged the minerals deal here last week or a week before last, I forget which, right? And in the new minerals deal that Zelensky does agree to, there's no payback to the U.S. You see, in that the latest signed minerals deal, Ukraine keeps all of the profits. They have to all be reinvested in Ukraine's development. The U.S. and Trump cannot pull out and pay back any. I mean, it's very explicit. It says that the deal. They create this investment fund, and the deal says all the investment must be for 10 years reinvested back into Ukraine. The U.S. And they said explicitly it's not to repay back anything that Biden gave them. Right. Also, you got to understand that investment fund is only one of three documents in the minerals deal. There's two more documents that are secret. The media's all even admitted there are two documents. We don't know what's in the other two documents. All we know is the one document on the investment fund where the U.S. does not get paid back. All the money goes into Ukraine. There's also a provision in that minerals deal that says the U.S. can contribute to the costs of the exploitation of the minerals 50%, and Ukraine will contribute 50%. This is part of all that's being regenerated, but some money from the outside can be put into the fund. Now, there's an interesting clause in the investment fund, and Ukraine has emphasized it, that says, the U.S.'s contribution to the cost of that fund can be in the form of military weapons. It's a back door. It's a back door for the U.S. to continue sending weapons. And as soon as that deal was signed, that's when Denmark, it was $100 million for the F-16s, and the Germans are throwing money in. I forget they're throwing 2 Patriot systems in, or 3 or 4 Patriot systems in Europe, which are $1 billion each, by the way. A Patriot system without even the missiles cost $1 billion. So half a dozen billion, 6 billion Patriots, and who knows what else. This is only what's been announced. So they're throwing money and weapons again into Ukraine. Does Zelensky want to negotiate when he's got all the weapons coming again and he's got money coming again? No, he doesn't want to negotiate. In fact, the Ukrainian constitution says that he can't negotiate any of these terms and conditions that are fundamental to Russia. He can't. By the constitution, they got to change the constitution. And then
it has to go through their parliament.
It has to go through parliament. And Russia knows this, and it says, I don't know that we can negotiate with you. You have no authority here. You're not even president anymore. Your presidential term ran out a year ago. You're there because of martial law. Anything we agree with you, you can turn around and say, it's null and void because I didn't have the authority. Right? Russians know that, but they're going to meet with them anyway.
Right. Right. And also, a lot of the land under which these minerals exist is controlled by Russia.
Oh yes, most of the minerals are in the east,
in the territory,
the south, and,
in the Donbass, in the Oblast,
in those 6. There's some of it in central area, Poltava and that area there that Russia hasn't occupied yet. But the Western Ukraine is all agricultural. There's no industry there.
So I think one of the telling elements to this, going back to early in our conversation, in terms of who's going to be in Turkey and who is not, who's going to be in Istanbul and who is not. If Sergei Lavrov shows up, I think that will be a very clear indicator of how serious Russia is in these conversations. If Lavrov doesn't show, then we know. And Willis Williams, thank you for that super sticker. If Lavrov doesn't show up, then of course there's no Putin. And if Lavrov does not show up, that lets you know serious negotiations are still further down the road. And it'll also be interesting to see if Trump shows up and Lavrov does not, or Putin does not. Trump's out there by himself.
I don't think Trump's going to show up.
Right.
Trump would not show up unless he knew the other two were showing up. And I don't even think he would show up then.
Anyway.
I think this is just Trump talk,
Right.
Because the U.S. position has been, Ukraine and Russia have to work out the deal. They have to do it themselves. Of course, Europe doesn't want that. Europe wants to be right there on Zelensky's elbow, right? But the U.S. and Trump has been, ultimately, you guys, we can play mediator, but ultimately, you guys have to sit down face to face and negotiate, right? I think Russia will send a high-level delegation. At most, Ukraine may send a low-level delegation and say, Putin didn't show up, we're going home. But I don't think Zelensky's going to show up either, especially, Trump is trying to push him. Trump is trying to say, I may go. Okay, if the president goes and Zelensky doesn't go, that doesn't look too good for Zelensky, right? But this is all petty maneuvering going on here. There's not going to be any resolution to this war because the parties are too far apart. In union negotiations, which I have a long history with, there's no sense in having a mediating negotiation unless you're fairly close, right? Then the mediator can try to help the parties do a horse trading and a quid pro quo and get a settlement, right? But if they're far apart, no mediator can do anything. And they're very far apart. They're far apart because Zelensky knows Europe's got his back. And the weapons are still flowing, right? He's not going to change his position. Russia's not going to agree unless Ukraine is ready, not just to announce no NATO, but to recognize those provinces in the east that are Russian now and part of Russia legally, right? And some sort of demilitarization of Ukraine's military. Because unless that latter thing occurs, it doesn't matter if they say, oh, no, NATO, they'll become NATO by some other name. The West will maneuver and get them in NATO by some non-NATO actually arrangement. And the Russians know that. Just saying, oh, okay, we'll be neutral, no NATO, that don't mean anything. For Russia's security, Ukraine needs to be demilitarized, right? Russia is saying, their initial position on that regard has been, you should have no more than 80,000 troops. Right now, Ukraine's got like 800,000, right? There's no way Zelensky's going to reduce his military because the neo-Nazis will take him out. Right? He knows that, right?
Well, in fact, that's another very important point. Is that when you look at all of the pressures that are on Zelensky, when you look at the external pressures, whether it's Europe support, which is a positive influence, whether it's Trump trying to, he also always has to look across the desk, look across the Rada, I think it's the Rada, and realize that there are Nazis gunning for him if he chooses to go against their wishes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the reality, I think. The U.S. Under Trump pulled its security protection for him. And right now the Brits are providing that security protection, personal security protection for him, right? So that's very real. And I'm sure he's getting the warnings all the time from these folks, through their contacts in his government. And, he's purging all the political opposition as we talk, just in case elections have to occur. These Poroshenko and some of the others, Timoshenko and others who might run against them, Klitschko, whatever, they're being arrested, right? They're being arrested. And of course, there's no free press there at all. There's no free expression of religion. The Russian Orthodox Church is being oppressed and arrested. Priests are being arrested. So all this, friend of democracy is just a lot of BS. It's very authoritarian. It's very corrupt, and it's not a democracy. That's for sure. But yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line. That one of the factors he has to keep considering. And I think that also plays in the fact that he's not negotiating. Remember, the South Vietnamese did not negotiate and refused to negotiate, refused to go along with the U.S. in the Vietnam settlement. And the U.S. settled with North Vietnam and then imposed the settlement on the South Vietnamese government. Same thing's got to happen here, but it's going to be very difficult here so long as the Europeans keep supporting Ukraine. The U.S. can sign the deal with Russia and pull out, but it can't force Ukraine so long as Europe, which is the big problem here, keeps supporting Ukraine in the war. And we know why. We talked about it already, why the Europeans don't want a settlement to this war either.
So that... But the thing that makes, well, there are a lot of things that make this incredibly nonsensical, but the European shift towards militarization is a losing proposition on every front. And why they followed Joe Biden down the rabbit hole of the Nord Stream, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, why they followed Joe Biden down the rabbit hole of antagonizing Russia to start this conflict in Ukraine. They can't win this. And so it's I understand the ideological aspects of it, but the practical realities of it, this whole thing about, oh, if Russia wins in Ukraine, they're going to take over Europe. Vladimir Putin has never expressed any interest in doing that. The very same way that the United States promotes, oh, we've got to confront China over Taiwan because China is going to take over Taiwan. Xi Jinping has never expressed any interest in doing that. These are all fictions that they themselves have created. So what are they? They're just reading their own press clippings and to the much to the dismay of their own people.
Well, I think the European leaders get to stay in power, and they get money for new toys, new military toys, right? I think that's part of what's really going on there, and that's why they want the war to continue. They get money to keep the U.S. engaged in NATO for a while, right? I think too, some of their generals in Europe express from time to time that they still think they can defeat Russia militarily. They think if they only go another year, that the Russian economy and or Putin will collapse. I think they believe that. They talk themselves into it. So there is.
Wait a minute, and you're an economist. Have you seen any indications that the Russian economy is on the verge that in another year the economy will collapse?
No,
the ruble will turn into rubble.
No, in fact, it's strengthened significantly because of the sanctions. The US and Europeans pulled out, and that gave a great opportunity for Russian businesses, financed by the government, to really take over the interstices of the pullout, and they've been doing great. Their economy is growing, wages, are growing 8-10% per year. GDP is 4 or 5%. GDP here in the U.S. is negative now, right? In Europe, it's been negative for a decade. It's been, there's been no growth in Europe, and that's maybe another issue longer term here. The Europeans, after the 2008-10 crash, could not get their economy going, right? They had a couple double-dip recessions during the 2010s, and then of course COVID hit, and the economy has not recovered at all. It's been stagnating, barely growing here and there. Some countries, like the UK and Germany, in deep economic stagnation here, or worse, right? They can't get it going because Europe is not competitive in the world anymore. They cannot compete with the more powerful economy in the US and in China and in the global South. The global South in the last 30, 40 years has industrialized. People don't realize this. That is not the global South of the first Gulf War, right? It's a different entity. Brazil and India and Indonesia and these countries, are not backward, undeveloped countries anymore. And they are coming together under the pressure of the West, and they're joining forces and trade and money and everything, called the BRICS, the big challenge to the West. And Europe is becoming a backwater. Europe is becoming politically irrelevant in the world scene and economically dependent on the U.S. in a number of ways. Not just because of the sanctions and the slow growth, but tax policy, trade policy of the U.S., it's making Europe more dependent on the U.S. So Europe is not a player in the multipolar world of the future. It's China, it's the BRICS, the global South, and it's the U.S. And Europe, they're a backwater now. Europe's going to be a nice museum to visit. That's about it.
Can you give me a couple more minutes?
Sure, I can give you as much time as you want.
Okay, so because this Europe piece, you mentioning this Europe piece to me is incredibly intriguing. And I go back to the Nord Stream pipeline and Joe Biden saying to I think it was Schultz at the time, we're going to blow up the Nord Stream will not be turned on. And that seems to have led directly to the deindustrialization of Germany and a diminution of the power of Europe, because they're now paying exorbitantly higher prices for natural gas
and oil.
So it seems as though, well, okay, so was that the beginning of the demise of Europe? And if so, why then did Europe do it to itself?
In January of 2022, I wrote an article entitled 10 Reasons Why the U.S. Wants Russia to Invade Ukraine. Okay, it's on my blog, jackrasmus.com. You can go read it. I
remember that piece, and we talked about it on the show.
Right. And in it, I indicated among the 10 reasons, right, the U.S. would reestablish its hegemony over NATO, which was weakening prior to that, right? Mm-hmm. And the U.S. would make Europe more dependent on the U.S., not just politically, but economically. Part of the goal, I always believe, was that to drive Russia not only out of the energy markets in Europe, but to drive Russia out of Europe economically altogether. And the U.S. companies would then enter the vacuum, mm-hmm. which is what they've done, not just in terms of energy provision. Why do you think Trump says drill, drill, drill? Mm-hmm. Because he knows the U.S. has to provide the oil and the natural gas, liquid natural gas, to Europe. And it has been, right, and it will continue to be. But that's not the whole picture. The banking system and other manufacturing, the U.S. has penetrated and taken over. I mean, it's like Plan B was for the U.S. to capture Europe, make it more independent, even if Plan A, mm-hmm. overthrowing Putin and taking the Ukraine did not work. Mm-hmm. They have succeeded. The U.S. has succeeded greatly in making Europe more dependent economically on the U.S. And, the latest tax and trade negotiations and crises, it's just part of this whole process of making Europe more dependent on the U.S., right? Politically, it's Europe is resisting, right? For reasons we've discussed mm-hmm. and described. But mm-hmm. economically, it's falling under the control of the U.S. economy increasingly. It's becoming a dependency of the empire. You see, mm-hmm. this is part of the empire changing. Empires don't remain static. They change. Right. They evolve. Right. They enter periods of crisis and recovery or collapse or decline. The U.S. empire is clearly in a period of decline, and it's trying to circle the wagons, you see. It's taking the G7 on Australia and Japan and so forth and circling. That's the core of the empire. And it's bringing it together more tightly and exerting control over it. And the Western Hemisphere, that's what Greenland's all about. Right. Taking Greenland, not just for the natural resources there, but it's part of the U.S. and Trump response to Russia's Arctic strategy, which is way advanced. The U.S. has no Arctic strategy. To do that, it can't rely just on Alaska. It's got to take the other pole, which is Greenland. And then all this talk about Canada is really forcing Canada to agree on its northern tier, Arctic tier, as part of this new strategy. And by the way, this guy Carney just become the PM there in Canada. The first thing he says is that, we're going to invest in the Arctic.
Right.
He comes to the White House and he makes that clear. He's trying mm-hmm. to say to Trump, you don't need to take us over. We're going to work with you.
We'll do it anyway.
Yeah. And then, the other pole is the canal. Why all the talk about taking over the canal
Panama
again? because China's been investing like hell into the canal, and the U.S. wants to stop that. And the U.S. needs to expand the canal. The Panamanians don't want to spend the money to expand the canal, and the U.S. needs it. Why? Because the new Gerald 4 super carriers can't go through the canal. It's not big enough. They got to expand that canal. They got to throw the Chinese out. And you see U.S. Equity firms investing there. I think, what was it, Blackhawk or something? I forget one of those. That's part of the Pacific strategy, you see. And the northern strategy with Greenland is develop, a counterpoint to Russia. And also, by the way, to prevent China shipping through the Arctic now that the Arctic is melting, So it's strategic. It's all strategic, and the media keeps talking about, crazy Trump. He's doing these crazy things. I don't think he's so crazy. There's a plan here. As you said at one point, he doesn't have an exact plan. This guy feels his way. He knows he wants to get to somewhere, and he moves here. He throws some shit over here against the wall. Then he moves over here, and he's kind of moving towards something. He doesn't know exactly how he's going to get there, but he keeps these initiatives off and on. He backs off, backs off on the tariffs, backs off on the mineral deal, backs off on Ukraine. He'll come back in another direction here. This is very much corporate negotiations. Feel your way as you go. You may have a plan, but you make it very flexible, and you advance and you retreat 1 step forward, 2 steps back, whatever, This is the way he works. So I think he has a plan, a very loose kind of a plan, objectives where he wants to get to. I think he's going to find a way to take Greenland one way or another. There may be a compromise on de facto U.S. control of the canal. But this is all part of the empire cannot afford the way it is structured right now. The U.S. is running $2 trillion plus a year deficits, which add to the national debt. The national debt's almost $37 trillion. We are paying rich, wealthy, and country and bank borrowers of treasuries, which are used to finance the debt, right? That $2 trillion. We are paying them now over $1 trillion a year. The U.S. cannot keep taking out of its tax and other forms of funding, paying $1 trillion a year to bondholders because of the deficit out of control. And it can't keep paying $1.3 trillion a year for national defense. $900 billion, $1 trillion just for the Pentagon, which isn't all a national defense. Defense is, there's other cubby holes of money.
Department of Energy, all kind of.
It's 1.3 trillion. All right. So 1 trillion for the bondholders, 1.3 trillion, for national defense out of our total discretionary taxes, doesn't cover it. And they got to keep issuing bonds. And now that interest rates are high, it costs more and more. So the empire has to cut its costs, particularly if it wants to reinvest in new weapon systems and in the Pacific. Part of the cost cutting is all this stuff you hear about USAID and NED and reducing the 45 4-star generals we have. After World War II, we had 4 4-star generals. We have 45. And that's not talking about 3-star and 2-star. The bureaucracy is bloated. It's true. It's bloated. Okay. And that's part of what the domestic cuts are about, as well as the foreign policy cuts. Now, the right wing and Republicans are using, of course, the cost cutting to come in and attack the working class, attack, the poor and everything. They're using that as, they're leveraging that, to go after Medicaid and all that other stuff. But the bigger picture is they got to cut the cost of government so that they can move the money around and reinvest in weapons in the Pacific. In fact, I'm writing a book about this called The Twilight of American Imperialism. Be out later, Clarity Press later in the year. And that's really what the argument is about. The empire has reached a point.
This is the end game here.
That you're getting to. It's structured. It's got to be restructured. And that's how you should think about Trump and what he's doing, as well as Vietnam, not Vietnam, as well as Ukraine, as well as Europe, as well as Greenland, as well as China. That's the big picture.
Final question for you. Talking about the canal, when you started talking about the Panama Canal and China's investment in the Panama Canal, that made me think a number of years ago, we were talking about China wanting to build a canal through Nicaragua, and that plan got put on hold. Do you see a situation where China reinstitutes the conversation, and based on what the United States is trying to do with the Panama Canal, then China decides, well, we'll just build a canal through Nicaragua?
No,
okay.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay.
The U.S. is not going to allow that to happen. Besides, the Mexicans are building a big port and rail line through southern Mexico. And from what I heard, China is now talking with Ecuador or Peru to build a rail line from the Pacific to Brazil.
Okay.
Through the Amazon. I don't know whether that's true or not, but they'll never be able to, even though Nicaragua may be friendly, the U.S. will not allow that.
Got it. Dr. Jack Rasmus, man, it's been too long, but it was worth the wait. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it, and look forward to having you back.
Anytime. My pleasure to join you. We're going to have a lot of interesting news here in the next month.
That we are.
The war won't end until it ends on the ground. And that's going to require another 300,000 Russian troops. Okay. Mm-hmm. And if they want to move west beyond, which they're going to have to do, beyond the provinces, probably in the north, in the Sumy, Chernihiv, and the Kharkov area, approach the gates of Kiev. That's the only time that Kiev is going to really, and Zelensky are really going to negotiate. And they're going to try to negotiate a kind of a Korean split of the country, I believe. Because Putin has indicated, he had an interview with Tucker Carlson about a year or so ago, and he indicated very clearly that Russia considers the Western Ukraine around Lvov not Ukraine. That was given to Ukraine by Stalin after World War II, and Putin made it clear, that they're not interested in that at all. That's not part of the Slavic homeland. So I think there will be some sort of split eventually, should Russia win further on the ground here, and we'll know by the end of the year whether that's possible. There will be some sort of negotiated division of the country, I think. Okay, sorry to extend that.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, okay.
Appreciate it, Jack. Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, my pleasure. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, folks, wow, that was some clarity there. I got to thank Jack Rasmus for joining me today, folks. We've got a new way to support the Connecting the Dots, and no, it doesn't involve a GoFundMe from the deep state. It's called the CTD Club. Just click that button, join button next to the subscribe, and for $4.99 a month, yes, just $4.99 a month. You're helping us stay independent. You're helping us stay commercial free. You're helping us stay billionaire proof, and yes, rhetoric free. And there are no sanctions. There are no sanctions involved in this. No tariffs. This is a $4.99, and that's tariff and sanction free. You'll get early access to content. You'll get member shout outs, loyalty badges, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're fueling honest conversations about national and international politics minus the spin. I saw a couple comments on the side that were throwing unnecessary shade at my guest. And folks, you may agree, you may disagree, but what you cannot disagree with is the honesty through which the analysis is being provided. You may not agree with the conclusions, and that's fine, because this is a virtual town square. This is where you can come, you can rely on the fact that the intent behind what you're hearing is free, is fair, and is honest. I don't have folks that come on here with agendas. So if you like your unfiltered, if you like your truth unfiltered, if you like your analysis sharp and your dots connected, join the CTD Club. Be more than a viewer. Be part of the reason that this all stays real, stays rhetoric free. And oh yeah, if you haven't already hit the subscribe, don't just hang out there in the smart corner of your YouTube. Folks, invest in it, own it. That's about as clear as we can be. Stay tuned. New episode tomorrow. John Jeter is going to join us tomorrow. Please follow and subscribe. Leave a review. Share the show. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots because this is rhetoric-free podcasting. See y'all tomorrow. John Jeter will join us tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.